Enhance 224 to 176. Enhance. Stop. Move in. Stop.
The Fujifilm worms, are they real or a figment of photographers' overactive imaginations? Yeah, they're real. So I recently went down the rabbit hole of Fujifilm image processing because I was unhappy with some of the photos that I was capturing, primarily photographing birds with the XF 150 to 600mm zoom lens. And I don't want to rehash all of that in this video, but one of the things that I came across is this phenomenon that people call worms in Fujifilm pictures that are processed in Adobe Lightroom. And I wanted to see for myself what these worms are, what they look like, and if there really is a difference in how Lightroom and Capture One process Fujifilm X-Trans photos, or if it's something to do with noise reduction and sharpness settings, and it doesn't really matter which one you use. And prior to this, I have been using Lightroom Classic to develop all my Fujifilm images and had never really noticed anything out of the ordinary. And I think this will be the experience for most people. And I kind of think the whole thing doesn't really matter too much, in my opinion. I also want to clarify that this phenomenon, these worms, only applies to Fujifilm cameras with an X-Trans sensor. So none of the GFX cameras should be affected by this. So I can't replicate the worms in Capture One. And I've seen a lot of people that point out that Capture One and Lightroom have different default settings applied, and that Capture One's default is more noise reduction and different sharpening settings. But even so, I couldn't really get worms to appear on Capture One images no matter how I changed noise reduction and sharpness settings, and how I tried to match the defaults that are applied in Lightroom Classic, which implies that there is some underlying difference in how Capture One is processing these raw files versus Lightroom. Now, the real question is, does it matter? I'm not a professional photographer. It doesn't really matter to me, as I can't really see the worms unless I'm zoomed in absurd amounts. And I find at normal viewing distances and normal cropping levels, I can't spot a meaningful difference between images processed in Lightroom and in Capture One. But I'm not trying to speak for everyone or minimize the issue for you, so you'll just have to decide for yourself if it's an issue or not. So that's the bottom line up front, but if you're still with me, let's do some real-world editing of a couple of these images and see what we get. I have a handful of images here, and we're just going to do a quick compare and contrast between how Lightroom and Capture One handle these images. So let's just get started. So this is a shot, and it is taken with the XH2S. Sharpening and noise reduction settings are different in Capture One and Lightroom. So that's one thing that will account for some baseline differences between how the two programs are showing images. So just jumping over to Capture One, by default, luminance, noise reduction is set to 50, detail and color are all set to 50. And here are the sharpening parameters, but these numbers aren't the same as you'll find in Lightroom. But anyway, going back to Lightroom, there is no luminance noise reduction set by default. Color is set to 25, detail and smoothness are all set to 50. So with all that said, let's just take a look at this image, and we'll zoom into 100% here in Lightroom. And as I said in the earlier portion of this video, you really do, in my experience anyway, have to zoom in quite a lot before you start seeing any weirdness, any problems, quote unquote, in Lightroom. So even at 100% here, I am hard pressed to find anything that looks out of the ordinary or problematic. Going into 300%, maybe. So right back here with these out of focus areas, you can start seeing this sort of swirly and maybe posterized look to some of that rendition, and maybe here, but it's pretty hard to see. If you crank the sharpening all the way up, it'll start to reveal that wormy patterning of the noise in this image. This is also at ISO 160, so we don't have a ton of sensor noise, without boosting the shadows and the exposure of the image. But in order to see this, I had to crank the sharpening and I had to zoom in all the way to 300%, and you can start seeing that kind of weird pattern. So let's look at Capture One and see what it looks like. So zooming in to 100%, again, not really seeing any problems. So we'll just go right into 300%. You'll notice less noise because we have more aggressive noise reduction set by default. So if we just reduce that and reduce that to their values in Lightroom, it starts to equalize a little bit, but no wormy things going on. So let's increase the sharpness all the way up to 1000. There's not that same kind of rendition in Capture One as there is in Lightroom. All right, let's look at another image. So here, this one is also at ISO 125. This I think is the XT5. So we've got the 40 megapixel sensor, and going right into 300%, you can see some of that wormy patterning happening in the foliage back here that's out of focus. And maybe you can see a little bit of that on the bark of this tree. But again, at 300%, we're already seeing the pixels of the image. So going out to 100%, all of that goes away. Increasing the sharpening all the way to 150. Now you can see it at 100%, but I can't really see it at the full resolution of the image. And then going all the way into 300%, you can see what that wormy pattern looks like. And jumping over to Capture One. So this is at 100, no problems, and 300. Don't see any issues. Let's reduce the luminance noise reduction and the color noise reduction. Still no problems here in Capture One. And then increase the sharpening all the way. That looks awesome. So here is a shot from, I think this is from the A6700. So this is Sony ISO 500. So if we zoom into 300% on this image, you can see what the grain pattern looks like. I don't know if you would call that wormy or not. It looks similar to the Fujifilm. And if we increase the sharpening, you can see how that looks. And if we look at the Fujifilm grain and the Sony grain, and let's look at this image in Capture One. So even with the Sony RAW file, there is an underlying difference in how these two programs are processing these images. Some of the recommendations that people will make in regards to Lightroom is to reduce the radius and the detail of the sharpening setting. And I still have it jacked up to 150, but reducing that radius and that detail really eliminated that worminess. And really it has more to do with the detail. But of course you're not getting the same type of sharpening if you're reducing the detail all the way to 0 as you would if it were at a different threshold, obviously. But that is something that you can do. You can see just by reducing that detail slider that it really gets rid of that worminess. Coming over to this one, really see that. If we decrease that detail slider, then it's kind of gone. So you can just adjust that to taste. Another thing you can do, if we zoom into this image here, increase the sharpening, you can see just how it is pretty nasty on this image for sure. This one is at ISO 2500, so obviously a lot more noise coming through. Reducing that detail and the radius doesn't get rid of it completely, but this image just has a lot more noise coming off of it. But again, zoomed out, you don't really see it. You can also do a couple things with the denoise right underneath that. You can just use the denoise slider. So this is the enhanced AI denoising algorithm that is in Lightroom now. You can adjust that slider. You can see if I go all the way up to about 60, it's really smoothing out that noise. So let's go ahead and just use that real quick and see what it looks like. 300%. Pretty much smoothed it all away. Of course, that might be too much noise reduction, but we still have the sharpening set all the way up to 150. And I don't know, I think that would be fine. So there's one way you can get rid of it. I'm going to unstack this. And then another way you can try to get rid of it is hitting that same denoise button. You can uncheck denoise and then have the raw details option checked. This has been in Lightroom for a couple years now, and I think this was touted as a way to help with the Fujifilm processing within Lightroom. We can just use that and see what it does. And it definitely doesn't get rid of the noise like the noise reduction gets rid of the noise, but it definitely changes that patterning, and it looks more similar to the patterning, the blocky patterning that you might see on the Sony image versus what it looked like without that. So 3 ways that you can try to tackle this really easily, and some with more processing and or with increased file sizes, so that AI noise reduction is going to spit out a big file, as well as the enhanced feature, but not even using the enhanced feature. If you just use the normal sharpening tools within and adjust the radius and the detail, you can really affect how that underlying noise pattern looks. Of course, there are other differences that might sway you toward Capture One over Lightroom Classic or vice versa, and you may want to check out other videos that go more in depth comparing the features of each. But if you're not using either one currently and you're deciding which to adopt and you're a Fujifilm shooter, it might be a little niggling back of your mind point of contention about how Lightroom handles Fujifilm. Let's call them brainworms, in which case Capture One could be the one to go for. But for me, I already pay for Lightroom Classic in Photoshop, and Capture One is actually more expensive, and there's no Photoshop in that equation. So even though Fujifilm is my photo camera system of choice, I won't be switching to Capture One. I guess I'll just be living with the worms.